What is the most underhanded compliment someone gave you? Story 1. One time, my daughter looked at me with the biggest, sweetest eyes and said, "Mom, you're so pretty today. You probably won't be tomorrow." I wasn't sure if I should laugh or start reevaluating my skincare routine. Kids really know how to humble you. Story 2. My 3-year-old niece once told my sister, "Mama, you must have the longest boobs in the whole world. I think they reach the ground." My sister's boobs are perfectly fine, but this little kid said it like it was the greatest achievement ever. I've never laughed so hard in my life. Story 3. At work, a coworker I can't stand looked at me and said, "Finally you found an outfit that works for you." I wanted to say, "Thanks, and I'm still waiting for you to find one," but I just smiled and walked away. Not worth the energy, but oh, it would have been satisfying. Story 4. When I was a kid, I got the dodgiest bowl cut from my dad's barber. The next day, the substitute teacher yelled at me, "That's enough, young man." I wasn't talking, but apparently my terrible haircut was loud enough for both of us. Story 5. My grandma's friend once said, "You have beautiful brown eyes like a cow." I didn't know if I should say, "Thank you," or start mooing. Story 6. When I was a teenager, I had to buzz my hair because of chemo. It was hard enough being 14 and trying to deal with cancer, but I was also grappling with the regular teenage stuff, feeling awkward, insecure, and desperate to fit in. One day, a hospital teacher came in to talk about keeping up with schoolwork, and as she walked in, she reached out and patted my bald head like I was some sort of golden retriever. "Aw," she said with a smile, "you're such a pretty boy." I froze. A boy? It wasn't intentional, I could tell, but my self-esteem, which was already clinging by a thread, took a nosedive. I managed to smile back at her, but inside I felt crushed. Looking back now, I know she didn't mean any harm. It's even kind of funny in hindsight. But at the time, those words stuck with me. Another little reminder of everything I'd lost. Story 7. 1. Thanksgiving, my stepmom finally decided to grace my home with her presence for the first time in over a decade. As she walked through the door, she looked around and said, "It's nicer than I remember." Nicer than she remembered? She hadn't been here in 10 years. I knew my house was in better shape than hers. She wasn't exactly known for keeping things clean. But her words lingered. It wasn't the nastiest comment I'd ever heard, but it felt like her way of knocking me down a peg, as if complimenting me fully would have cost her something. It's funny how family can find the most creative ways to insult you without ever raising their voice. Story 8. When I told a guy I was dating that I was a feminist, he actually said, "But you're cute." The relationship didn't last, and neither did his dignity when I told everyone about it. Story 9. One of my earliest memories of school photos is from 2nd grade. My mom had decided not to buy them that year, saying, "They never turn out nice anyway." She didn't say it to hurt me, but her words burrowed deep into my little brain. From that moment on, I hated having my picture taken. Even now, at almost 40, I flinch when someone points a camera in my direction. My mom wasn't malicious. She just didn't realize how much a careless comment like that could sting. Over the years, I've tried to make peace with it. But honestly, there's still a little kid inside me who wonders why her own mom couldn't see her as picture perfect. Story 10. I was helping my obese father-in-law move furniture, and he goes, "You're pretty strong for a skinny little guy." "Thanks. But next time, how about you pick up the couch?" Story 11. Growing up, I was always the smart one. My mom loved to brag about my grades, my awards, and how I skipped several grades in school. But when it came to my appearance, she was far less complimentary. I remember one day, out of the blue, she said, "You should consider being a leg model. You'd never make it as a regular model, but you've got great legs." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. Did she think that was encouraging? Because it sure didn't feel like it. I was 12 years old, already self-conscious about my height. I was 6 feet tall and towered over everyone else my age. Her words made me feel like my looks weren't good enough, like the rest of me didn't measure up. It didn't help that my siblings were all shorter, more traditionally attractive, and seemed to glide through life with ease. I, on the other hand, felt like an awkward giraffe, constantly reminded of my flaws. As I got older, I threw myself into academics, hoping that if I couldn't be the pretty one, I could at least be the successful one. I ended up earning multiple degrees, graduating magna cum laude, and landing a great career. My mom was proud of that. She bragged about it endlessly, but her comments about my looks never stopped. Even now, when I look in the mirror, I hear her voice in the back of my head, reminding me of all the ways I don't measure up. Story 12. When I was around 6 years old, my dad took me to his usual barber for a haircut. The barber gave me this bowl cut that was, well, let's just say it wasn't a look. The next day at school, we had a substitute teacher. I must have been talking too much because she called out from across the room, "What a naughty boy!" My face went hot as I realized she thought I was a boy. At 6, I didn't have the confidence to laugh it off. I remember sitting there, cheeks burning, feeling like I wanted to disappear. These days I can laugh about it, but back then, it was mortifying. I still cringe whenever I think about that terrible haircut. Story 13. One summer during a family barbecue, my grandmother's friend looked over at me and said, "You have such beautiful brown eyes like a cow." I blinked, not sure if I should say thank you or moo. I could tell she meant well. Cows do have gorgeous eyes after all, but the delivery was something else. Everyone at the table laughed, and I laughed along with them, but inside I was mortified. I think what made it worse was that she genuinely thought she was being kind. To this day, cow eyes has been a running joke in my family, and I'm not sure I'll ever fully live it down. Story 14. My grandma was always quick with her compliments. Once, when I came downstairs for dinner wearing a new dress, she squinted at me and said, "Oh, you look nice. Today." Today? What about every other day? She didn't mean it in a nasty way. She probably thought she was being encouraging. But I couldn't help dissecting her tone. Was it a compliment with an expiration date? A jab disguised as praise? Over the years, I've come to realize that was just her way, dropping little verbal puzzles for me to figure out. I miss her, but I don't miss how much mental gymnastics her comments required. Story 15. When I was 14, I had this terrible habit of looking up to people who didn't deserve it. One of those people was Becky, a friend who, in retrospect, probably wasn't much of a friend at all. I remember sitting with her during lunch, lamenting how my body wasn't developing as quickly as the other girls. She turned to me, her voice sugary sweet, and said, "You're so lucky you don't have big boobs." Lucky? At the time I wanted to believe her, but the way she said it didn't feel like luck. It felt like pity wrapped in passive aggression. It stuck with me, though. Every time I looked in the mirror, I heard her voice. It wasn't until years later, when I finally grew into myself, that I realized Becky wasn't giving advice. She was just trying to make herself feel better. Story 16. When I brought my white partner home for the first time, my mom didn't even bother to hide her shock. She looked him up and down, then turned to me and said, "What does he see in you?" I froze. I mean, what kind of question is that to ask your kid, especially in front of their partner? She tried to laugh it off, saying it was a joke, but it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. It wasn't about race. She just couldn't wrap her head around the idea that someone like him would be into someone like me. It took years for me to untangle how much her words affected me, but that moment is still burned into my memory as one of the most backhanded compliments I've ever received. Story 17. I had a coworker I couldn't stand, one of those people who pretends to love everyone but always manages to sneak in a jab. One day I walked into the office wearing an outfit I'd spent way too much time planning. She looked me up and down, smiled, and said, "Finally, you found an outfit that works for you." I stood there, stunned. Was that supposed to be a compliment? Because all I could hear was her implying that every other outfit I'd worn had been a failure. I wanted to snap back with something clever, but all I could muster was a tight-lipped thanks. To this day, I wish I'd said, "And I'm still waiting for you to find one." Story 18. One time, when I was in preschool, My daughter looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes and said, "Mom, you look really pretty today. You probably won't tomorrow." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Kids have this uncanny ability to cut straight to the bone without even realizing it. I ended up laughing it off, but later that night I couldn't help staring at my reflection in the mirror, wondering what tomorrow would bring. I love her to death, but wow, preschoolers are savage. Story 19. When I was about 12, I was on a long drive with my grandma and her friend. Out of the blue, her friend turned around, looked at me, and said, "You're so pretty. If only you were pretty on the inside, too." I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. I was sitting right there. I laughed awkwardly, pretending it didn't sting, but inside I was reeling. My grandma just nodded along like it was the most reasonable thing to say. To this day, that comment lingers in the back of my mind every time someone compliments me. Was it genuine? Or did they mean something else entirely? Story 20. It happened at Thanksgiving a few years ago. My stepmom hadn't been to my house in over a decade, and to be honest, I wasn't thrilled about her visit. We've always had a strained relationship. She's one of those people who can't help but throw shade even when she's trying to be nice. So, when she walked through my front door and looked around, I braced myself for whatever was coming. She smiled faintly and said, "It's nicer than I remember." I just stared at her, not sure how to respond. It was such a backhanded comment, acknowledging that my home was nice while also implying that it hadn't been before. Story 21. The thing is, I know my house is nicer than hers. It's cleaner, more organized, and frankly, better decorated. But I didn't say any of that. I just forced a smile and said, "Thanks," because what else could I do? The rest of the evening was a blur of passive-aggressive remarks, but that one stuck with me. It wasn't the harshest thing she'd ever said, but it reminded me why I kept her at arm's length. Story 22. Looking back, I realize her comment wasn't really about my house. It was about her own insecurities, her need to put others down to feel better about herself. Still, it stung. Even now, I can't help but roll my eyes whenever I think about it. That was her way, always finding a way to diminish others while pretending to be gracious. Story 23. One of my favorite burns came courtesy of my 3-year-old niece. My sister and I were sitting in the living room when her daughter suddenly looked up from her toys and said, "Mama, you must have the longest boobs in the whole wide world. I think they reach the ground." My sister has perfectly fine boobs, perky even, but her daughter said it with such awe, like it was the most impressive thing she'd ever seen. My sister just stared at her, mouth open, while I burst out laughing. Kids, man. They'll destroy your self-esteem with zero hesitation and think they're paying you a compliment. Story 24. I was about 6 when my dad took me to his favorite barber shop. I'd never been before, but he insisted this guy was the best. The shop smelled like aftershave and old leather, and the barber was a no-nonsense man with a shiny bald head and a booming laugh. My dad told him I needed a simple trim, but somewhere along the line, that request got lost in translation. When the barber spun the chair around to reveal my reflection, I stared in horror at the bowl cut he'd given me. It was uneven, way too short, and made my round little face look even rounder. My dad, oblivious, smiled and said, "Perfect." The next day I walked into school dreading what my classmates would say. It didn't take long for the comments to start. One boy immediately pointed and shouted, "What happened to your head?" But the worst moment came during class. We had a substitute teacher that day, and I'd been chatting too much with my friend. She called out from across the room, "That's enough, young man!" My heart sank. She thought I was a boy. I remember sitting there, cheeks burning, unable to move or speak. It was like every insecurity I had about the haircut was confirmed in that one humiliating moment. When I got home, I burst into tears and begged my mom to fix it. But there wasn't much she could do. It was so short already. She tried to comfort me by saying it would grow back soon, but a month is a lifetime when you're 6 years old. Every morning, I'd wake up and stare in the mirror, hoping for some miracle overnight growth that never came. It didn't help that my classmates kept calling me Bullhead, or even worse, Johnny. Years later, the memory still makes me cringe. It's funny now. I can laugh about it when I tell the story, but at the time it felt like the end of the world. That bowl cut taught me two things. First, never let my dad pick my hairdresser again. And second, sometimes, even when the world feels like it's against you, you have to find a way to keep your head up, bad haircut and all. Story 25. When I was 18 months sober, I was feeling good, proud even. I'd clawed my way back from rock bottom, and though the journey wasn't over, I was making progress. Then a friend, who I thought was being supportive, hit me with, "Wow, 18 months sober. Congrats! Don't forget, you're always an addict." It was like a punch to the gut. I knew the intent was to remind me not to get complacent, but it came off as dismissive of how far I'd come. The word always stuck with me. It felt like no matter how much progress I made, no one would ever see me as anything other than the person I used to be. I smiled and nodded at the time, but deep down, I knew I had to redefine success for myself, not through anyone else's lens. Story 26. When I was about 14, my sister's friend, a guy I had a tiny crush on, once told me, "You have such scary eyes, but they're kind of pretty." I didn't even know how to process that. Scary? Pretty? Were my eyes haunting him like some kind of Disney villain? I obsessed over his comment for weeks, staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to figure out what he meant. Eventually, I realized he probably didn't even know what he was saying, just some awkward teenage attempt at flirting. Still, scary but pretty is something I've carried with me, like an inside joke I didn't know I was a part of. Story 27. When I was 14, I was diagnosed with cancer. I don't talk about it much because it's not exactly something I like to relive, but there's one moment that still plays in my head whenever I think about my teenage years. After the second dose of chemo, my hair started falling out in clumps. I tried to hold on to it for as long as I could, but eventually my parents and I agreed it was time to buzz it all off. Sitting in the bathroom, watching the clippers glide over my scalp, I tried to hold back tears. I wanted to be brave, but inside I felt like I was losing the last shred of myself. A few days later, a teacher from the hospital's education program came to visit me. She was supposed to help me figure out how to keep up with school while I was undergoing treatment. She walked into my room, took one look at me and smiled. Then she reached out, patted my bald head and said, "Ah, you're such a pretty boy." I froze. I could feel my cheeks burning and my stomach churned with a mix of embarrassment and anger. Did she not realize I was a girl? I was already struggling to accept how different I looked without hair, and her comment felt like a slap in the face. She probably didn't mean any harm. She was trying to lighten the mood, maybe, but her words stuck with me long after she left. I spent the rest of that day staring at myself in the mirror, wondering if I really did look like a boy. It was one of those moments that cemented all the insecurities I already had. Now, years later, I'm cancer-free, and I can laugh about it, but back then, it was one of the lowest points of an already rough time. Story 28. In high school, I used to hang out with a group of popular girls who always made a point to admire me for something. The phrase I heard most often was, "I wish I had your confidence." For years, I took that at face value, thinking they were impressed with the way I carried myself. But here's the kicker. I wasn't confident. Not even close. It wasn't until years later that I realized what they really meant. It was a backhanded way of pointing out that, as a bigger girl, I had no business being confident. I think about it now, and it still stings, but it also makes me laugh. Jokes on them, I wasn't confident then, but I sure as hell am now. Story 29. A coworker I barely got along with decided to compliment me one day. I walked into the office wearing a simple dress, and she beamed at me and said, "You know, you're a lot smarter than you look." I stood there, trying to decide if I should be offended or amused. Smarter than I look? What was I supposed to look like? Someone who couldn't read. I managed to laugh it off in the moment, but the comment stuck with me. Over time, I've turned it into a kind of badge of honor. If people want to underestimate me, that's their problem, not mine. Story 30. My mom, God bless her, has always had a way with words. When I was about 12 years old, I came into the kitchen one morning and she looked me up and down before saying, "You'd make such a great plus-sized model." I froze. At the time, I wasn't plus-sized, but I was hyper-aware of my weight, already spiraling into an eating disorder I was too ashamed to tell anyone about. Her words weren't meant to be cruel, but they felt like a spotlight on the one thing I wanted to hide. Years later, I know she didn't mean any harm, but that moment left a scar. Story 31. A few years ago, during a family holiday, my mom sat next to her friend at the dinner table. The friend looked at me and said, "Your daughter is so pretty." I felt a warm glow of pride for about 2 seconds until my mom replied, "If only she were pretty on the inside, too." I was sitting right there, fork halfway to my mouth, stunned into silence. My mom didn't even flinch, like she hadn't just lobbed an emotional grenade. Everyone at the table laughed nervously, and I pretended not to care. But it was a long time before I could look at her without hearing those words echo in my head. Story 32. When I was about 12, my grandma said something that stayed with me my whole life. She and her friend were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, and I was hovering nearby, hoping to snag one of the cookies they always had on hand. Her friend smiled at me and said, "Your granddaughter is so pretty." I froze, a little embarrassed but pleased. Then my grandma, without missing a beat, replied, "If only she was pretty on the inside." I stood there stunned. My cheeks burned, and I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I wasn't even sure what she meant. Was I a bad person? Did she think I was selfish, rude, or spoiled? Or was it just her way of knocking me down a peg? She must have seen the look on my face because she added, "I'm just joking," and laughed. Her friend laughed too, albeit awkwardly, but I couldn't shake the comment. I didn't even feel like eating the cookie anymore. For years, her words would replay in my head whenever someone complimented me. Pretty, I'd think, but not on the inside. I started overanalyzing every little thing I did. Was I being kind enough? Thoughtful enough? Was I somehow proving her right without even realizing it? Looking back now, I don't think she meant it maliciously. That was just her way. She had a sharp tongue and a habit of making jokes that often landed more like stings. But as a kid, I didn't know how to process that. I only knew it hurt. Even now, as an adult, I still feel a pang of self-doubt whenever I remember that day. It's amazing how something said so casually, something she probably forgot about the minute she said it, can stick with you for a lifetime. Story 33. One time, when I was in college, my professor returned an essay I'd written with the comment, "You write so colloquially." I smiled, thinking it was a compliment. I'd poured a lot of personality into that paper and felt proud of how conversational it sounded. It wasn't until years later that I realized colloquial wasn't exactly praise in the academic world. It was a polite way of saying my writing wasn't sophisticated enough. Now, I look back and laugh at how naive I was, but at the time I thought I'd nailed it. Sometimes I still wonder what that professor really thought.